Hi, and welcome everyone to the third of 5 films about psychologically informed environments, or PI. And if you think about the 5 or 6 principles of PI, there's the idea of training and support for staff. There's the idea of reflective practice and reflecting on a framework or an eclectic framework of some kind. There's the concentration on relationship building and building relationships of trust, which is at the core. And then the last 2 are about thinking about the physical space and the environment, which helps reflection where you're working. And the last one is about evidence-generating practice. So they don't really stand alone, but they're linked together. And so this week, we're going to think about the first 4 of those by interviewing J.S. Levy, who's the author of a number of books, including a pre-treatment guide around homelessness. And he's going to talk about the 5 principles of pre-treatment. And as you listen to this interview, you might want to get a pen and make some notes. And you can think about how this approach links those things together. So he talks about a number of different frameworks in his interview. And he also concentrates on relationship building and about bridging the worlds between the clients we're working with and other worlds like statutory services of addiction, maybe of mental health, and others. And he concentrates on the relationship, and he thinks about, he's very reflective, and he talks about helping staff to reflect on those frameworks. And it's an example of how a short training film, for example, doesn't have to be a film. You could have someone speaking to your team, but can be, like Phil Conn mentioned in the second film, you could use a short film and some ideas from some training and then help the staff to reflect on that. So this is an example of that. You could watch this half-an-hour film with staff and you could reflect on the 5 principles and see what staff think in terms of staff development and training. So the last couple of points of PI, evidence-generating practice and thinking about the physical space, we're not going to concentrate so much on this week. We're going to think about those first 4 by interviewing Jay and seeing how his 5 principles connect to those ideas. Hope you enjoy the interview. So hi, welcome everyone to today's blab, our live streaming blab about interviewing Jay Levy. Hi, Jay.
Great to be here. How you doing, Ray?
I'm good, thanks. I'm good. So today what we're going to do is we're really excited to have Jay here to talk about pre-treatment. So just to start things off, I'm Ray Middleton, a system broker at Fulfilling Lives in Newcastle and Gateshead. And we work with over 100 people there with multiple complex needs. And the structure for today's interview is we were hoping to interview Jay for maybe 10 or 15 minutes to look at the 5 principles of pre-treatment. So just to start things off, Jay, do you want to say who you are?
Sure. So I'm someone who's been doing homeless outreach for a few decades now. Started out in New York City and then made my way to Boston. Worked in the shelters and on the streets in both areas. Was privileged to do some work out in the woods in Western Massachusetts. And it was really great that people would welcome me into their worlds and show me kind of how they were living by the riverside, and really work on connecting people to the services and the resources that they need. Got into writing and talking about pre-treatment based on my own experience of some of the difficulties of either connecting with folks or developing the trust or being able for folks to be able to access the services that they really need. And from there, I've been very busy as a regional manager for both Western and Central Massachusetts, work with Elliott CHS homeless services, currently connect and oversee about 8 outreach teams that kind of work across half the state of Massachusetts.
Right, yeah, that's really helpful. And it sounds like there's been a bit of a journey there about how your interest and ideas of pre-treatment came about. So is that really, in terms of your journey, is that what provoked these thoughts and ideas which have formed into the ideas about pre-treatment?
Yeah, it really did. It's a very hands-on kind of journey, as you say. I started out, I remember my first client that I was working out at the Port Authority in New York City, came across a gentleman by the name of Old Man Ray. I write and talk about him in the books that I wrote. And I really think about him as being my first field advisor. Because, when you're new and in the field and first connecting with folks, it's easy to think, especially as you're a new graduate with your degree and you have your list of resources and services, that you're really the expert. And kind of Ray taught me the lesson that he wasn't, let's say, all that open to the services I was offering him. And he didn't really see me as the expert. In fact, he was right to think that he was the expert on his own world. And I was kind of knocking at the door and probably should have been more or less asking permission to get in and to connect with him. And instead, I was trying to very quickly, move him along, kind of do this fast food approach to outreach, which really, for the folks that are out there and have transitioned and adapted to some degree to homelessness while still maybe struggling on a day-to-day basis on the challenges that might come up. Those are the folks that are out there and in need on the one hand, but on the other hand, they've gotten a sense of kind of what they're doing, maybe a sense of meaning in the world. And I think as outreach workers, it's really important for us to connect to people's meanings and where they're at. And that's really the key, because the question that Ray brought to me that I had to really think deeply about is, what do you do when you're offering services, when you're saying, hey, I can help you? The person seems to be absolutely in some sort of need. I mean, it's very evident by observing the person. They might have medical issues. It might be 10 degrees outside. But the question is, if you're offering a service and the person says they're not interested, then what? Does it all fall apart? Or is that where outreach really begins? And so what do we do from there? And that's what pretreatment kind of came out of that basic question.
That's a really helpful introduction and helps us understand the context and the journey that you've been on. So what that makes me think about maybe is the first principle of pretreatment is about relationship formation. And would you be able to say for a couple of minutes, just describe what you mean by that being the first principle of pretreatment?
Sure. So there's 5 basic principles, and this is very much person-centered work, and everything begins with the relationship. And if you don't have that, there's really not much you can do. I mean, that's really the foundation of the work that we do. And it's about developing trust with the person, respecting autonomy, which I think is a piece even in a lot of the journal articles. I don't always read that as the upfront point that's made, but it really is a combination of those two, developing trust and respecting the person's autonomy. We're really seeking permission to enter the person's world, to understand where they're coming from in terms of their words, ideas, values. And when I talk about engagement, I break it up into various stages, which I don't know if you want me to go into the stages now, or
maybe if you could briefly maybe say what the stages were, but we'll come back and go into a bit more depth a bit later on.
Well, basically the stages take us from the very beginnings of that initial communication with someone to the point of making goals. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Okay.
And there's 3 stages, and we can get into that a little more in depth.
That's great. We'll revisit that a bit later in this discussion. So then I'm thinking about the second principle, which is about creating a common language, or common language construction. You talk about it in your books. Could you just describe for us what you mean by that?
So it really is this sense of 2 worlds coming together. You got the world of the person who's doing outreach, and you got the world of the person who's experiencing homelessness. And the person that's experiencing homelessness has their own sensibilities around, the words that they use, their ideas, their values. And the question is, how do we connect? How do we form a common language, a strong communication with the person? And again, it's something that I break into some stages. The stages are entitled Understanding a Person's Language, Utilizing the Language Within the Work, and Bridging Language, which is a very important phase. But when I talked about engagement and all these things, really come together. They're simultaneous processes, really all 5 principles that we're going to discuss. So we're talking about it, for presentation purposes as separate pieces of the puzzle. But when you're doing the work, it's really 5 simultaneous things that you want to be aware of. And on one level, we're engaging and right there with the client. And on another level, we're thinking of assessment, kind of where are we in each of these principles in our work with the person. So jumping off of engagement, as we get to that point of making goals, which is the last phase of engagement, it's very important that that goal is set in a common language that the client can embrace. So pre-treatment is very much a goal-centered work that we do with the folks that are out there, as opposed to being problem-centered. It really is based on where people are at, which is why I talk a lot about stage theories, and I talked about that with engagement and now with common language development, because the stages help us to stay in line with where the person is at, and it helps us to assess whether our intervention is staying in line with that person.
That sounds really helpful description there, because I'm thinking people can hold in mind the different worlds. So the different worlds they may have come from, and they may be informed by different kinds of professional worlds like mental health or social work or other kinds of addiction type world. But also the really important point there about understanding and creating a common language, because with the people you're trying to help and understanding their language, their world, and creating a common language. So that's a really helpful, and I appreciate what you're saying about by splitting things into maybe 5 key principles. It helps us to see that they're integrated, but that they are connected as well. So I just wondered then about whether you could say something briefly about the 3rd principle, about supporting the process of transition and adaptation. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, and right before I get to that principle, I just wanted to make a comment on what you just said about this idea of the different worlds, because it's really a cross-cultural enterprise, if you think about it.
Yeah.
So, we talk about cross-cultural in the sense of, both sides of the Atlantic, but I think very much so in the work that we do, it's all about connecting. The outreach person is really in a very fortunate role, because we get to be in a place where on the one side is the people that we're trying to do the outreach to and the work, we're trying to understand their world and where they're coming from. And then on the other side of that boundary of the outreach that we do are the resources and the services, and it's up to us to really understand that world and how it works. And of course, it's about bridging, about bringing these different worlds together. And then on the other hand, like you said, the outreach worker might have come from a very different sensibility, culture, place. Even if you've been homeless yourself, no one's experience is exactly the same, and no one's road to recovery is exactly the same. So there's many roads of recovery. It's really important to be very open with a good ear to be listening to where the person is coming from, to kind of get across that cultural divide that I would suggest is always there and is really the challenge of homeless outreach. Now, talking about transitions, the way I like to think of it is transitions are happening everywhere. And if we have a real ear and an eye to it, we can really jump on what I call the transition bus toward doing the work that can be very helpful to people. So if we're very sensitive to the transitions that people are going through, and then we offer help that kind of can resonate along the lines of the transition and the challenge that the person is facing, they're more apt to be, I think, interested in what we happen to be offering. So a good example is, let's say you're working with someone and they're first entering a hostel or a shelter type environment. Well, there's a transition to that process if they're new to it. And if you're the outreach person that maybe is working in that environment, or the counselor, or however you want to frame it, the worker, you're in a good position to do a nice welcome and a good orientation to the environment and to help the person to understand how their needs can be met in that environment. So that's what I would call jumping on the transition bus. I mean, it's right there. It's right in front of you. They're entering a new environment, help the person transition and adapt. And then again, that really helps with the engagement process. And it gives you kind of the beginnings of a playground of language, because you're both working off of the common experience of what's going on right around you in that orientation to the hostile. So the same thing on the streets. It's really cueing into all of the transitions. So let's think about it. When somebody meets someone that's new, that's a transition to person, it could be an idea to transition to a new idea. It could be a stage of our relationship. Like, think of how different the stage is from an initial engagement stage to, let's say, termination. There's a transition to those phases of the relationship. Transition and adaptation to different environments, whether it's a homeless environment, the streets, survival, how the person's getting along to help with that process. Transition to housing, of course, is very, very big in the work we do. And then the other big piece that I always talk about and try to frame out is the transition to resources and services. And that can be very complicated in terms of, again, you're dealing with office culture and the eligibility criteria of other places and what the workers at the other end sort of expect when you present someone with complex needs and you're trying to help them enter that environment. So I think it's really up to the outreach clinician, counselor, worker to be thinking about what's the best way of supporting transition. And I think you can get into some real specific ways of doing that. And I'm sure people do that all the time. So this would be a great question to even open up to the group that's listening. Like, what do they normally do to support transition with the folks they're working with?
Definitely, and we'll discuss that in a bit more depth. And also, I'm thinking we've got a great team of what we call navigators here in Fulfilling Lives, and they are doing just that work. And so I think some of these ideas would be great to share them with the team, because they do some really good, challenging work, as you'll be aware of in the States there, about on these transition, trying to do this, create a common language and trying to help people transition into those, just the things we were talking about there. So I think those are kind of ideas sound really relevant to the kind of work we're doing here. So I'm just thinking now about the fourth principle, about facilitating change. And if you could say something briefly about what that principle is, that'd be helpful.
Sure. So in regard to facilitating change, I'm really drawing off of Prochaska and De Clemente and their theory of change, the stages of change. It starts with pre-contemplation, which is the first stage, and it goes right through action. And then, of course, it's maintaining whatever the change is. So there's a maintenance piece. And then there's a relapse prevention or relapse counseling considerations as you do the work. So it's really, again, I think a very helpful stage model for thinking about where are people at. Now, what's interesting about the stages of change is I would say it's a little bit more of a problem-centered focus, because you're thinking about, when I say a little bit more, I think the rest of what I'm talking about is a bit more focused on specific goals and where the person's at and kind of taking them from there to the next point in their journey. In regard to stage model, I think, at least I find it helpful to be thinking in terms of some very general categories like the issue of homelessness, the issue of work or getting income, the issue of addiction, the issue of mental health concerns, and medical concerns. So I kind of, in my mind, in doing the work with people that are out there, think in terms of those 5 basic categories and the problems that people face in those areas. And then from there, break it down as to where is the person at into each specific area in terms of the change that they might want to see happen. And that from there, that's where a goal can come up. The person wants to work on the goal of change that they're embracing. And you can say, okay, where are they in this process?
That's
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's really helpful, because I think some of the frustrations about engagement, although there can be lots of different reasons, sometimes it's about maybe assuming someone's at a different stage of that cycle of change. And just thinking about where people might be at can help the engagement improve the quality of the relationship, because there's a better understanding about maybe those breaking into stages, and then the work can be more effective.
Yes, I mean, the hallmark of pretreatment really is it's getting where the person's at, right? So exactly. That's why we're talking about all these different stage type theories that help people to be in line with the person and not to get ahead. We tend to get ahead of ourselves because we so deeply want to move people forward and see people placed and improve the quality of people's lives. And I think that's really something we have to look at in our reflective practice. That are we getting too far ahead of where the person is at? And is that actually getting in the way of our work? And I think it can. I mean, it's very important that we're always optimistic and that we have a lot of hope. But at the same time, we need to understand where the person's at and to join them at that place.
Definitely, that's so helpful, and that idea about not despairing, maintaining the hope for someone, but also holding a realistic view at the same time about the situation. And I love your idea there about if you're helping someone on their journey, you need to meet them where they're at first and not get too far ahead in the journey, because then there'll be a miscommunication. So I'm thinking about the fifth principle, and I'm thinking about promoting safety and thinking about crisis management. And do you want to just say a little bit about that fifth principle?
Sure. So, my experience in terms of my own work and with the staff that I work with, that certainly on a day-to-day level, we're very concerned about people's safety. I mean, today it's 20 degrees here in New England. It's pretty cold. And, we're meeting people that are roughing it, that are sleeping rough, that are outside, that at this point maybe don't want to come in, so they're making the choice to stay out there. But then on the other side of it is the question of, well, how safe is the person, and is crisis intervention needed or not? Can we do some harm reduction type approaches? So safety, I break it down into two different categories. One would be the crisis intervention piece, and the other is the harm reduction piece, and both are equally important. I think for staff and for myself, when I was doing the work, we tend to get very stressed around the crisis and our concerns of the people out there and how they're doing. But the beautiful thing about crisis is it's a real opportunity to support change. And so I'm very big in talking with staff about the idea of really embracing crisis when it's there, as opposed to something that we want to maybe, stay away from or avoid, and then actually some bad things can happen if we're not there to really intervene during that period of time. So crisis intervention is really a key piece of the work. It's a real opportunity to support change for the person, because when a person is in crisis, I mean, think about what's happening. Their normal ways of coping and dealing is hitting a wall. It's not working for some reason. So their normal way of surviving out there, or their normal way of coping, mentally, psychologically, it's not working at that moment. And so you're seeing these new types of what we call, in clinical language, like acting out behaviors, or a person all of a sudden not in this equilibrium with their environment like they were. So again, this connects with transition and adaptation, which is the third stage. They're no longer adapted to the environment that they're in. And so at that point, a person tends to be more open to help. And you can actually, in a more matter-of-fact way, say, well, how about we consider now doing this? So a lot of the focus on crisis intervention, you can take a little bit more of an assertive standpoint as opposed to that laid back, just offering options kind of thing, saying, hey, I'm really worried about you. And if you have developed that trust, and this is the key, because I think, like I said, everything comes out of the relationship. So if you got that relationship and you show that concern, a crisis point is a place where you can be more assertive and directive. And to get to, I think, Ruth's point on that whole piece that you wrote about the car and talking about the car as a pie and the tendency, like when is it okay to encourage or to do behaviors and actions and interventions that might encourage dependency. Crisis is a time where it's certainly okay to do that, where you want to really be with the person, you want to transport them or get the authorities to transport them if it's not safe, an ambulance service or however it works. But it's a time where we can really connect people directly to services.
Yeah, never waste a good crisis, I think, is a good way to think about it, because obviously we've got all those concerns, but there's also, as you say, and you articulated it very well there, Jay, is the potential to think differently, to do things differently. And thinking about a journey, a crisis can be a point of thinking, well, maybe there's a crossroads here, and maybe the journey of my life could go in a different direction, and the worker can have a role there if they built up trust, to kind of reconsider a different approach. So I just wanted to thank you, Jay, before we open it up, to kind of going through. Go on.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about harm reduction.
Oh, yes,
minute to do that, because I think this is an important part of promoting safety. So crisis is sort of one pillar. Harm reduction is the other pillar of promoting safety with the folks that we work with, because often people are not in crisis. Now, it's interesting because sometimes the worker's in crisis, but that doesn't mean the client is. So that's an interesting thing, because we sometimes get so concerned. We're like, oh, it's a crisis, we got to do something. And then we try to tell people what to do or how to do, and really the person's not in crisis. We're the ones in crisis. So I think this idea, again, of having that time for reflection and staff integration, where you're having meetings and talking about these things, reflective practice, is really so important. I know that's a big principle in PI, and I agree with it. I think it's absolutely needed. The idea of doing harm reduction work comes out of, at least in the States, I don't know how popular this is in England or across the UK, is out of needle exchange programs. Is that something that you have out your way?
We do, yes. And harm reduction is quite an established idea within the whole field.
Great. So this idea of IV drug use and doing the needle exchange piece in order to reduce the risk of HIV and AIDS, that's kind of a prototype of where harm reduction comes out of in the States and probably in the UK, it sounds like. And the important thing there is, it's a win-win situation, because you're making the community safer, as well as the person that's actually using drugs, even though they're still using, they're safer with a clean needle. And so when you think about like outreach and engagement, let's sort of expand this notion of harm reduction now. Let's say it's a cold night and you give someone a warm blanket, that can be a form of harm reduction. Now, what I want to say about that, and I think this is really important, I think this also holds true in terms of this prototype of harm reduction with people who are IV drug users, and that is that it's not just the process of giving the person the blanket that's living outside, but it's also using that blanket as like a need item. So once again, we're sort of circling back to engagement and relationship building through our harm reduction practice. We're getting where the person's at. We're giving them the blanket because they're in need of that right now to be a little warmer. But then we're also now engaging a little bit more because they know we're giving them something they need. And it gives us a chance to open up the avenue of discussing about maybe other ways that their world can be, other options they might have, whether it be housing or shelters or hostels. But really this idea of how to get to a safe place, even to maybe work out a safety plan, like maybe today you're okay and the blanket will help you, but what if tomorrow you're not okay and you're going more to that crisis mode? Is there something that you would do? It actually helps to set up, if a crisis were to occur, you can then talk back to that plan that you came up during that harm reduction phase and the work you were doing. So harm reduction, I think, is really, really important. And to me, it's not true harm reduction unless you're really using it as a way to further engage and to begin to plant seeds toward future options, whether that's for treatment or housing or a service that the person might need. If you do that all together, to me, that's a real solid harm reduction approach. And it doesn't mean that the person is ever going to take you up on the things that you're offering down the road, but I think that at least needs to be a piece of it if we're going to call it harm reduction.
I think you've articulated that really well, Jay. And just to recap, I think that's helpful to have that description of the 5 principles and how you linked the fact that they are all connected together. So if you think about the the relationship formation and building trust can link to the common language construction, the second principle, and then supporting the process of transition and adaptation is only possible if you've got some trust in the relationship and a common language. But then you're into facilitating change, the fourth principle there, and you can think about different models of change to help with that. And then the fifth principle about promoting safety. And in a crisis, how you described how well, although there might be a crisis management approach, the harm reduction can also thread into all the other four, because that could be an opportunity through harm reduction to build trust, to build relationships, which may then link back in to some of the other principles. So it's helpful to have articulated them. And I know you go into a lot more depth in your books, which people could read about those things, about those principles. But you've helpfully thought, if you're helping people with a journey, these are really good 5 principles of pre-treatment, but they're not standalone, and they thread through and link to each other, and they can build on each other. So Jay, that's really helpful.
Thanks, everybody. Good seeing everyone.
Thanks, Jay.
This is the third of 5 training films about psychologically informed environments. I hope you found this one helpful and interesting. It was an interview with J.S. Levy about his 5 principles of pre-treatment. And hopefully on reflection, you can see how that links together the first 4 ideas in PI in terms of training and support for staff, which watching the film could be, or getting hold of his books and reading them, but also about concentrating on relationships and building relationships of trust, and how we talked about bridging those relationships into other services that have different kinds of ways of thinking. I also thought about frameworks, and different frameworks of some kind. He mentioned a number there in his interview. And reflective practice was really important, and he's a very reflective person it came across in the interview. And also he helps his staff team to reflect in the way they think about those frameworks, concentrate on relationship building of trust. So hopefully you found that helpful, and there'll be a 4th film next week. Do let me know any feedback or what you think about it, and let Jay know. Okay, thank you.